All right, guys, we're gonna get started. How's everybody doing? Oh, there's so many of you. I can't see that. Thanks for missing hopefully part of Power Glove. We're the Super Marcato Brothers. A lot of you probably know that. This panel is about our original homage music that we've written over the years. We're so excited to present a panel on this. Maybe the most specifically about us panel.
But hopefully in talking about our experience with creating homage music, we're touching into something a little more broad about following in the footsteps of great composers.
And hopefully helpful.
And how to navigate that.
And interesting to a lot of you is what I hope is.
And part of the whole reason we're doing this is because we just have, all three of us, been personally almost on this quest to celebrate so much of the music that we grew up with, so much incredible video game music and game music composers, in a way that we didn't necessarily notice a lot of other musicians and artists approaching it. There's a very robust and vibrant VGM remix community. There's several of those, and have been for decades at this point, which is so awesome. But I think part of what really excited Karl, Marty, and I, because we are composers ourselves, and so much of how we learned how to write music was by studying the music of the legendary video game composers like Masato Nakamura.
Well, I think
and
it started
Koji
before
Kondo.
we studied it. It started from just playing the games as kids and realizing that it was like part of our DNA.
Yeah, so basically the point of our panel today is we want to sort of help to share some of the tools that have helped us learn how best to emulate the sounds and styles of composers from different series, and why that's a useful tool for someone who's interested in creating not just video game music, but music in general. I mean, there's an old adage about, before you can create, you have to learn how to imitate.
Sure.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can touch on what it might mean to add a chapter to an existing great book, the work of a composer that we love. And that is something that we're striving for in our music. And it's not limited to our little homage projects. This is really a phenomenon that is, I think, unique to video games, maybe more than any other medium. Sequels are such a vital part of our video game market. And sequels work a little differently in video games than they might in movies or television.
How often do they have the same composers?
Well, and
Not all that often.
Because video games, they have code that gets updated and they deal with interaction, often we think of a sequel as a kind of quasi-remake, almost in every case. And maybe we're remaking something about the play system. And because of that remake nature, we kind of want to bring people back to a similar spirit, a similar tone and landscape, but we want to provide new material
Something
with
new
that.
and fresh. You don't just want it to be a rehashing.
Right, so we have a lot of game composers that contribute to these long-standing series that are occupied with some of the same questions that we are, which is how can I add another page, another chapter into this book, but not have it feel like it's a cheap imitation, but its own piece of music that can hopefully inspire
I think
someone.
a lot of the questions that the three of us have asked ourselves in various projects that we've worked on, I think are similar to questions that a lot of other video game composers have had to ask themselves when they've been faced with entering a beloved installment. Mahito Yokota, who did the music to Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, I think he had an enormous responsibility of carrying sort of the weight of that flagship franchise, and he did a wonderful job. Someone like Toru Minegishi, when he worked on The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. I mean, there's so many
examples, yeah. Well, we wanted to show you guys just a little example of some of our homage projects that we've put out over the years. This isn't all of them. This is maybe 60% of them or so. If anyone isn't familiar with some of our homage projects, we thought it'd be fun to just give you guys a very quick smattering, short examples of some of the homage projects we've done to give you a sense of what do we mean when we're saying homage VGM. Some of you might be a little confused. So let's kind of take you through this trip now. Will, Marty, and myself have done a lot of projects that honor series that we all know and love. Everything from
Super Mario 3.
Super Mario 3. to Mario World. To the Sonic series. To Mega Man. To Kirby. To Metroid Prime, some of our favorite games of all time. To F-Zero. Zelda series. All the way to Mario Galaxy.
One of our B sections, I would say.
And there you go. That was a very quick crash course in Marcato Bros. Homage VGM.
So basically, if any of you were confused, that was all original music that we composed. So it's new melodies that we've written and basically arranged to sound like pre-existing video game soundtracks. And we're going to sort of now, for the rest of this time, break down just a couple pieces that each of us have composed, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we made it and I guess what about the source material really inspired us to want to create new music in that style. And one of the things that's interesting about this process is we really aren't that interested in creating like sound-alikes, where essentially we don't want to just start with one track and just move a couple notes around until you get something that's functional.
And philosophically, we don't want to replace anything. We want to...
We can't either. It's impossible.
Yeah, and that would be folly, and we don't like the spirit of that. This is music that we love. We want to add to that music. Sometimes we'll use a mental exercise. We imagine, are we in an alternate dimension where that game doesn't quite exist, and instead there's this slightly other level that needs a piece of music.
Or that maybe just if those soundtracks were longer, these would be additional pieces that you could...
Well, let's start off with a track composed by Marty from our project Hello World Adventures in Mushroomland.
So this was an attempt to follow in the footsteps of our hero in video game music, Koji Kondo. You may remember in Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, he took sort of a new approach from that of previous Mario games where he wrote a central theme. And then that theme is adapted in different ways throughout the game depending on the kind of environment you're in and that sort of a thing. He ended up kind of maintaining that philosophy in Mario 64 and in other projects. So when we knew we were going to tackle this idea of a Mario World tribute album, it ended up being a double album project where we were celebrating Mario World and its quasi-sequel, Yoshi's Island. We knew we needed a central theme that would capture the spirit of Mario, would also be malleable in different forms, and would hopefully be memorable and appealing. So we can take a listen to the final product here, which is called Jump On In. And then we you're very sweet. Thanks.
Yes, feel free.
Thanks. So it's the objective that I was describing was actually a really intimidating objective, because this is music that we really love, and ultimately what we're aiming for is something that's so distilled, and it's hopefully very primal and elemental, and could feel like it. You could maybe take it away in your pocket on its own, and we're using sounds, and Karl worked on the implementation of those sounds so that we hopefully take you there to that Mario World place, but we also want it to be able to live on its own as its own piece of music.
Yeah, the sounds are there to kind of lead you to the doorstep of it, to make you feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, Koji Kondo evokes so many different kinds of musical expression, almost every point on the compass. There's a lot of really daring, dissonant writing for a lot of his boss themes. He really explores modes in a really interesting way, particularly in his music for the Legend of Zelda series. But the music that he's maybe most famous for, his primary themes for Mario, that music is so often about what we'd call consonance, which is the opposite of dissonance in music. Dissonance is that sort of jarring quality of
That's
sound.
not jarring to me. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you've elevated. So yeah, sounds that are not at rest or not at repose. And Mario is so often about this just beautiful consonances, you know. Sorry. And the original Mario theme it's almost like this celebration of C major and C major triads.
It's a C major party.
Yeah, and actually C major features often in a lot of Koji Kondo's Mario music. So before I even had an idea or knew where I was going to go, I just wanted to be rooted in C major, to be in that landscape. But yeah, really what I was looking for here is, in terms of the harmony, the sound of the relationships of the notes to the underlying chords and the relationship of note to note in time, I wanted a lot of beautiful consonances. And then I also wanted a melody that wasn't too crowded or had moments of great space and then some moments of dance and turn. So ultimately what we have here is... and that's sort of the final germ after some whittling and some other ideas that sort of kicks off the piece, and then there's development from there. And ultimately, it was the image of Mario or a character like Mario. Maybe it's like Mario, but with different skin tone or different gender or something. But I know the spirit of that character and how they make me feel. And that's what I'm trying to capture in this piece of music.
Good job.
Thanks. So what I didn't do, and I think this might be maybe even more instructive than what I did do, is I didn't take an existing piece of Mario music and say, pull the chord progression from that and start writing on top of it. Although that's also a really helpful exercise. Will mentioned the adage earlier. Actually, there's a lot of adages now, I can't remember, but basically like imitation is a form of composition, especially in the earlier part of your journey.
Imitate and then innovate or something.
What I would encourage about this process, if there's anything to maybe take away from it, is if you are to follow in the footsteps of a composer that you love, really see just how much you can assimilate, just how much you can integrate from their vocabulary. And I've been playing the music of Koji Kondo since I was in middle school, and I'm just obsessed over it. It's a problem.
It's almost like have their same tools. Make sure you have their same tools in your toolbox to start.
And what I didn't do is take a piece of music and replace the melody. Another thing that I didn't do and wouldn't encourage is to try to find whittle hooky melodic phrases in existing pieces of music and just pull and take those. Although plenty of composers can find value in that. Again, I think as much as is possible to experience the assimilation with the music and then see what starts to come out with your own intuition and your own expression, I think is crucial.
Cool. So what do we got next here? Okay.
Yeah, so that's some thoughts on that. Next, we're going to look at a piece of Karl's, which is written in a Sega Genesis style. This is for one of his ongoing and wonderful Sonic-esque projects that started before the Super Marcato Bros. Podcast and has continued on since.
Yeah, 2011. This is Sonic-esque Volume 4, which I think was 2014, 15. Yeah, so the track that I'm going to be playing and talking about today is called Soaring Gadget from Sonic-esque Volume 4. And this one was probably the one I was the most proud of on this album. I think the biggest Sonic tracks that I was really inspired by and moved to try to capture, if it was at all possible, would probably be Flying Battery Zone, Lava Reef Zone, Hydrosity, Act 1 and 2. Those are some of them. And so those tunes were something that I was really thinking about when writing this one. I wanted to write something that the first 5 seconds that anyone heard it, that they would just be in it and just be on board and hopefully want to listen to the whole thing. Again, Marty talked about the importance of using the original sounds that we grew up hearing, and so making a Sega Genesis album using the same sound chip, obviously, and even the same samples, like the drum samples, that kind of leads you to the doorstep, and so it lets your imagination not have to do so much work. So that was really important for me to get the sounds right, and also after we played, I'll talk a little bit about some of the more technical elements of it. So let's just take a listen to Soaring Gadget from Sonic-esque Volume 4. And that is Soaring Gadget from Sonic-esque Volume 4. And so for this tune, the starting place was actually ripping all those individual those MJ-esque samples from Sonic 3. Being able to actually use those and input those into a new piece of music was so much fun, so I couldn't resist doing that. But I really wanted the piece of music to sound nothing like the tracks from Sonic 3 that had those samples, so it's kind of this weird trip. One interesting thing that I was excited to talk about with this song is this section here, maybe like the C section of this piece. I did something that we've done a lot in our homage projects where we go outside of the source material completely. And so this C section actually wasn't that inspired by any specific Sonic Genesis music. Instead, it was inspired by music of that time for arcade games. There was some other Sega arcade music I was listening to from the early 90s that I was actually a little more inspired for that section. And I thought that was kind of a fun way to make it still feel comfortable and familiar in that era and in that style, but to maybe surprise people a little bit more. But yeah, so for me, the most important thing with this was that riff. I knew I wanted a riff, this riff here. I knew I wanted something that would catch you immediately. And as soon as I came up with that riff, really everything else kind of fell into place as far as having the four on the floor kind of dance beat and even how I would incorporate those samples and everything. So that riff, I think, is probably the most clearly inspired by specific Sonic music. But what was also important to me is for what I would consider like the main melody of the track, which comes a little later, which is that synth lead. Again, I wanted that to not necessarily remind you of a specific Sonic track and like, oh yeah, he's going for this, just to be something that is comfortable and in the vibe of Sonic, but something that maybe we haven't quite heard before. And so I think the riff was a way of getting you in and being on board for it, and then hopefully kind of trusting where the song is going to go for that main melody, and then especially that C section. Really fun thing with a project like this is every single piece of music on all of the Sonic-esque volumes, and a lot of our music is this way, has to loop, just like the original Sonic music did. So getting like a really exciting cadence for that final section, knowing that it's going to go back into that opening riff, really affects how you write. And what I love about the loop point is sometimes it can feel like a new feeling or a new piece of music. Even if you've heard that riff before, the context of it sometimes changes after that C section. It might kind of set up that minor chord in a powerful way that you might not have had that context when you started the track. And so I really love that kind of experiment of trying to make a loop point not feel like a loop point, but feel like it's still continuing, and you might not hopefully notice that it's looped for 2-3 times. So.
Well, and one of the reasons why we do projects like this is it really excites us, because I think part of it is so much of this music really inspires our imagination when we're kids, and this was sort of a way for us to keep playing in those worlds ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think we do it because we just have so much fun doing it. That's the #1 reason we do it.
Well, and we've learned sort of over the years that there are so many individual things that make up a certain composer's or a game's style or sound, and so much of those, you really have to spend a lot of time with the music to notice certain commonalities and traits, and when you apply those to your own music, you can create something completely new that isn't just a derivative knockoff of something else, but pays clear reference to that material without, you can't take these 5 notes and these 5 notes and say they're the same, or really even reminiscent of one thing in particular.
Yeah.
I think that's what Karl
Yeah,
did well.
and one last thing, because I forgot to say, is what was cool about Sonic-esque Volume 4 is I was trying to pay homage to all of my favorite Sonic composers, whether it's Michael Jackson or Masato Nakamura or Jun Senoway, and trying to roll all of that into one thing. Like, what do I love about all of these people? And that was
where
what,
can they meet?
Exactly.
Actually, yeah.
Let's move on to a track by Will from Child of the Chozo.
So this is an album that I made in 2014, and it was a tribute to the entire Metroid series. So the album has 3 halves. It has an 8-bit chunk, a 16-bit chunk, which sounds like the Super Nintendo, and a bit that was inspired by the Metroid Prime games. And I was really curious about exploring the way that in a series of video games that you could take some of the same melodic motives and develop them in different ways as the technology would improve. So I kind of had fun celebrating the music of Hirokazu Tanaka in the first part of the album, and then the work of composers like Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano for the later stuff. I'm going to play a track from the later portion. I think this track
The
is
prime portion,
yeah,
if you will.
this is called Planetfall in the Wetlands, and I was really influenced by sort of like the Talon overworld in Metroid Prime, or Torvus Bog from Metroid Prime 2, the Chozo ruins. I really like that sort of atmospheric synth stuff, but mixed with like this kind of hip-hop fusion and these 808 drum samples, and that,
So cool.
that music's just so wild and has a really cool specific sound that I was really curious kind of like playing around with. So yeah, this is my track, Planetfall in the Wetlands. So yeah, for this one, it's kind of interesting because like for most of our projects, we tend to be celebrating, NES music, Game Boy music, Super Nintendo, Genesis, stuff from the 80s and 90s.
A lot of SNES.
So it was interesting trying to do something in the style of like, GameCube circa like 2002, because it's not old enough that it's like retro and charming, and it's not new enough that it's like always real orchestras and real instruments. But one of the things that I loved about Metroid Prime is it has this timeless quality where the limitations are almost non-apparent, because the fact that it uses these like general MIDI choral sounds, they almost have this really alien quality to them that really adds a lot of atmosphere. So I just became obsessed with the sounds in those games and trying to find whatever ways I could of replicating them. Most of the music that we've done that's chiptunes, it's done in trackers or done with programs that can emulate synth chips. I didn't have that kind of luxury with Child of the Chozo, so it was basically just, I spent a lot of hours going through lots of like free to use synth plugins and
a lot of
certain
trial
stuff
and error
that I already had. The biggest victory to me was that sine wave lead that's like so iconic. I found it in this
Kenji.
program that was basically an exact emulation of a Moog synthesizer, and like this thing literally had like a digital version of cables in the back that you could plug in. So I was reading all these tutorials on how to program a Moog synthesizer to create like a just basic sine wave, and when I was able to finally get it, that was one of the most exciting moments I ever had as a composer, because it was like,
you knew you needed to capture
Metroid
that
Prime's
sound.
like my favorite game, so when I was able to get that sound and discover it, it was really cool. And
So
there's lots
exciting.
of little things like the drum sound there. It's these old, Roland 808, or I just went through a bunch of old kind of stuff until I tried to find ones that sounded almost identical.
The reason Soundbank was a huge help for
Yeah.
you, because that's around that era, like
Right.
mid 2000s, maybe early
And then
2000s.
in terms of the composition itself, there's a lot of things about the Metroid music that were really fascinating to me. One of the things I noticed most of all in the project was that so much Metroid music is about half-step relationships in terms of chord progressions. So like, sorry, yeah, whatever, I'll do it up here, but like, there's a lot of songs that kind of are oscillating between a half step from the root. So you notice things like that when you're playing a lot of music from a series, and like, that's just something interesting. But something that I really liked about the Prime music, Marty talked about the modes earlier, but a lot of that stuff is written in sort of natural minor, which some people might call the Aeolian Mode, which means that it doesn't really sound classical, because like in classical music, you have sounds like this, where the 5 chord is major, so it sets up the tonic right there. But in a lot of the Metroid games, they use the Aeolian Mode.
It's almost more kind of modern pop.
Yeah, it has a lot of similarities to a lot of popular music, and so, but there's a real simplicity to it. But there's also something kind of bittersweet and painful. So for this track, there's a lot of.
Yeah, that minor 5 is perfect.
Just kind of playing around with those sounds, and then also just noticing certain melodic characteristics. Like I noticed that Kenji Yamamoto would like to have melodies that were very pure and simple, but would just change a couple notes. So I had this line in mind that went ya da da ba da 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 ya da 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 da. It's like the two halves have the same shape, but there's just subtle little differences. So when I was writing, I would look out for things like that. It's not exactly like, oh, his melody goes like da 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 da, so I'm gonna make it da 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 da. It's more just about noticing general, almost like a philosophy of composition. And that's something that I don't know, I loved working on this project, and I still can't believe that I was able to get it to sound like that, because I kind of thought that would just be some weird pipe dream. And I don't know if any of you guys actually know the Metroid Prime music, or if it's just something that I'm really
Does anybody know Metroid Prime out there? Yeah, I was blown away when Will first showed that to me back in my old apartment. All right, let's move back to a piece composed by Marty from Hero of Legend.
Thanks. So this is one of our more recent homage projects. It's something that we had been talking about amongst ourselves for a long time, and really for years we were maybe, to be honest, a little too intimidated to actually crack on. This is a project. It will be 3 volumes in total. Only the first volume has been completed at this point.
You guys heard actually something from Volume 2 in that montage.
That was
so.
hidden in there.
World premiere.
And so this is to celebrate the music of The Legend of Zelda. And so the idea, quick little plug, the 3 volumes will hopefully cover a pretty broad era of Zelda music. And our goal with Volume 1 was to capture the 8-bit character of mostly the original Legend of Zelda, but also maybe the spirit of Zelda 2. And
maybe even more than that.
Maybe even Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. So the piece that we're going to play is actually the Prologue. It's the first track, and it's called Waterfall. And I was picturing...
Picture. Art by Carlos. Let's hear it.
Oh, yeah.
Carlos.
Thank you. Let's hear
Beautiful.
it. For this beautiful artwork.
Anyway, you were saying?
Yeah, I was picturing
word picture.
the waterfall that would be the backdrop for our opening sort of scrolling prologue to get our adventure started. And what excited me about this was I wanted to pull from the spirit of later Zelda entries that I love so much, like Link to the Past and I'm old. These still seem later to me. Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, and that particularly beautiful, melancholy world that Koji Kondo helped to create.
Do it on an NES.
But bring it back to the NES. So it's what if the games had always started with that
Almost
sort of...
there is a fairy fountain quality.
Yeah, exactly. So what if they had always started with that sort of tone? And so this was programmed on a tracker so that it could actually be played accurate to Nintendo Entertainment System. And I tried to use the limited channels to evoke something like a harp, and then the noise channel, which basically controls the kind of static that would have been on your television, to hopefully evoke the sound of a waterfall in the background.
This is Prologue.
So that's
Yeah.
an attempt. Oh, thanks, guys. Again, it's one of the, there's something that we love about doing these projects, which is that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and so it's not always carefree working on it, but it can be really satisfying if you think you're getting close to the target. So I talked about this beautiful sort of melancholy that I think Koji Kondo captures. Honestly, in the opening music of, say, Ocarina of Time, and this is something that's been followed by later composers and later games. So that's sort of one. That's an essence that I'm trying to capture. Also, there's so much beautiful Zelda music that is evoking water. And yes, I'm trying to use the noise channel to kind of crudely make water sounds. But I also love how Koji Kondo, and going back to composers of the past, like Ravel and Debussy, and Vivaldi, and how they would evoke water musically. And often we all reach a similar kind of idea. There's something about these falling arpeggios that's very evocative of water, particularly a waterfall. And so we've got this kind of rising and falling arpeggio here, and I may butcher it.
We'll also
as
the
you get-
tempo changes evoke water too.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to program these tempo changes in the Nintendo so it feels like there's a human playing this harp at the top of the waterfall or something. And then the melody itself, the main thing that I was focusing on, and it's true that sometimes the smallest ideas, the simplest ideas can really take the longest to arrive at. Other times they can just fall into your head while you're walking out of your car or something. And I wanted a gem that would really speak to me, and then I was expecting that I'd probably transform that gem and move it downwards. So what I ultimately landed at was and then that transforms and moves
In
downward.
a very Kondo-esque way. And resolving on that one major 7 is
And so
just,
we're evoking these
just
major
perfect.
7th chords like Karl's referring to. That's almost the sound of melancholy. So here's a major A-flat major triad. And here's if that chord extends into a major 7 chord. Just
To resolve
beautifully,
on that,
gorgeously
yeah.
sad and wonderful.
happy and sad together.
And so our progression descends, and this is a progression we see in video game music a lot, and particularly in the Zelda series a lot. So kind of a simpler and shorter piece of music, but some of the thoughts in trying to get into the world of Zelda.
Well, and also it's like that particular progression is something that's happened so frequently in the Zelda series, like specifically, and that rub of the major 7th is something that we knew we wanted to capture,
Right.
and so we decided to put this track at the beginning. We decided to put this track at the beginning of the album because, again, it's not like an imitation of Koji's like bolero, like dun 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 dun. We didn't want to make a sound
Yeah.
alike to that. We wanted to make a piece that would be elegant and simple, but could capture like what we thought was great about Zelda music. And I can't imagine a better opening than Marty's prologue here.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was so great.
Next, we're going to look at a piece from something I alluded to earlier. This was the second half of
sequel.
our Hello World project, and this was to celebrate the music of Yoshi's Island.
Which is so good, right, everybody?
Yeah, we love
How
Yoshi's
good is
Island.
Yoshi's Island?
And this comes from the opening track of that album, which was written by Karl.
It's actually the second track.
Oh, sorry, the second track. Yeah. So there's a prologue. There's a prologue there
That
as
Will
well that
wrote.
Will composed. That's gorgeous.
And then I did this, which is
And then
called...
this is sort of the first track after the prologue.
Yeah, this is called Down on Dino Island, and this one I had so much fun with. This one was an interesting example in the context of our playlist here, where there was one specific track that was very inspirational for me, and it was the title screen of Yoshi's Island, which is so different. It's such an oddball track on that score. If you guys know that track, it doesn't really sound like anything else in the score, but it kind of does because it's tropical and fun and child-friendly. But it's just something about it. It's like groovy and also very simple and folk-like, and so many weird things in one. It's just a really, really unique track, and I wanted to capture really the emotion of that track. That was really all I wanted to capture, and I did end up using some similar techniques. Again, I wanted to lead people to the doorway with some of the same samples and sounds and instruments from the original Super NES title screen.
And
There's some sound effects.
Modes too. This one also, I think they both use the Mixolydian mode.
And that's such a great way to get a little bit of kind of this planing, kind of wandering, kind of static emotion where you're not really going anywhere specifically. And it's just great for a title screen because it doesn't necessarily feel like it's going to end, or it works really well for a title screen. And so yeah, you're going to hear some similar instruments to the Yoshi's title screen, but what was really important for me with this one is I didn't want the actual musical material to really sound a lot like the Yoshi's Island title screen. That wasn't interesting to me at all. I just wanted to capture the emotions and the spirit, and what I loved about really that whole soundtrack in this particular track. And so I hope you enjoy Down on Dino Island from Hello World Journey to Dino Island. Cue the bass. Ooh, not quite.
You gotta
Bass is
learn your
coming.
own music, Karl.
It's been a while. Here it comes. A little bit of Kamek vibes with this part here. Well, that is just a little bit of Down on Dino Island from Hello World Journey to Down on Dino Island. Yeah, so this one started off really thinking about that title screen a lot, but as I was writing it and coming up with the later sections, I wanted it to, like the Yoshi's title screen, it's a very long piece of music that evolves and goes through a lot of different sections. It's just looped there, actually, for about almost 2 minutes, over 2 minutes, which is very long for that era. But then as I was coming up with those later sections, I was pulling things from like the Kamek theme, or like even like I guess like the map theme maybe a little bit. And so it was really fun to kind of pull from more things. And yeah, this one I was imagining in my head, like if there was an alternate reality where there was a game kind of like Yoshi's Island that needed a title screen, I thought maybe this would be a fitting way to do it. Yeah, so the first thing that I came up with was that, really the rhythm of that. Didn't even know exactly the notes, I just knew that rhythm, and I thought, hey, that's pretty catchy, and it sounds simple and folk-like and something you might hear someone play on like a pan flute on the beach or something. Right. That was kind of what was in my head. And yeah, the Mixolydian thing I stumbled across pretty quickly because it also kind of reminded me of some other like Koji Mario tracks that have that vibe, or Zelda tracks really too, that kind of have that very continuous, looping, kind of endless quality to it, and it just worked really well. It was difficult to use, you guys remember this, the kalimba samples.
Right.
Have a lot of overtones on them for the Yoshi's Island.
That's true in real life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was difficult to find the right range. It was really important that it was in a specific key and that the notes I was choosing, there's not a lot of choices. And so the kalimba was one of the first things you hear in the Yoshi's title, and so I thought that would be a good thing to lead you to that doorway. So that was, that was basically my thought process behind Down on Dino Island.
Well, and what's fun, hopefully with some of these you'll see that all of these tracks we had sort of a different approach. That was one where clearly Karl was modeling the arrangement after a specific piece, but the composition isn't necessarily a sound-alike to that. Mm-hmm. Where with something like the Prologue that Marty did is almost the opposite. Like he's very specifically putting his finger on like a kind of melodic and harmonic trait that you find in the Zelda music, but arrangement-wise and thematically, it's not really based on any
this is the
one
opposite,
piece.
where I was going for the spirit and the emotion of it.
So usually for all of these, it's important to us that there has to be some part of it that's very closely reminiscent of something from the game, whether that is the arrangement, whether that's a chord progression, whether that's
the
something.
sounds,
But it
yeah.
usually, I think to your point earlier, Marty, this comes out of a labor of love. It's like we listen and study this music to see what we like about it, and then we sit down fresh to write something new. So there's, because we wouldn't have any fun if it was just kind of like, I don't know, trying to just slightly change around something that already exists. We build all of this stuff from the ground up. And that's part of the fun of it, is to sort of be inside those worlds.
Well, let's move on to a track that Will composed from our album, our ever-growing album, In Days of Old. This is a really interesting one because every 6 months, a year, we add 2 tracks to it. Yeah, this is a track that Will composed called In Days of Old, the title track.
Yeah, so my goal with this one was, it was a broader influence. I wanted to make something that could sort of pay homage to a lot of the great SNES JRPGs, and that music that is particularly the sort of soulful, melodic ballad character, and that sort of fantasy music. To anyone who listens to our podcast, you've probably heard us talk about the Dorian Mode, which the Dorian Scale is a minor scale, but it has some chords that are borrowed from the parallel major. So in regular Aeolian minor, you would hear, but in Dorian, it's, so like a lot of the music to the Lord of the Rings, or, you know, one of my favorite Dorian examples is from Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yeah. It's a great theme.
You know, it happens all over the
Right?
place in video games. So my goal with this one, I think it was a celebration of Chrono Trigger and a celebration of, you know, Final Fantasy,
Uematsu.
you know, 4, 5, and 6.
Let's take a listen to In Days of Old. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Here we go.
Ghibli-esque as well.
Yeah. So I think rather than this, I think arrangement-wise, you can hear probably some influence from Final Fantasy VI. And one of the things that I love about that score is how it has sort of like a Western quality. And I think there's always been this interesting pairing for me about Japanese music and a lot of almost like Sergio Leone Western kind of that vibe, the Ennio Morricone stuff. And I thought that pairing in Final Fantasy VI was so perfect. I think what I wanted to do in this track most of all was celebrate the almost melodic characteristics of a lot of great Japanese composers, because there are certain tendencies that I would just notice, not just in video game music, but Marty was even alluding to this in film music. One of our favorite composers, Joe Hisaishi, who does a lot of the Studio Ghibli films, he was a big influence. Another influence, something like Fire Emblem Awakening, Hiroki Morishita, a lot of that sort of harmonic vocabulary. Just some of those same kind of chords I was talking about, that Dorian Mode, but then on occasion, you know, you'll hear those sort of those more juicy and surprising jazz chords as well. Those were the kinds of things I was looking for, but I really just wanted to start with a melody that was very pure and memorable and singable, because that's one of the things that I love so much about video game music. And then it was sort of through the arrangement and all the other elements that I was more specifically trying to evoke. Oh, this bit here reminds me of Chrono Trigger. I think in terms of the arrangement, this was done in a 16-bit Super Nintendo style, and this was back in the day when we were ripping all the samples ourselves. So nowadays we use a program called C700, which actually allows you to load things on, like you can load SPC files and channel the different instruments, but back then, we would rip the sounds ourselves. So basically play a bit of a track, isolate one channel, and whenever there's a long note, just rip a wave of that long note, and then using our own samplers, pitch it up and down. It was kind of a nightmare.
Yeah,
but that's how we made a lot of our 16-bit music. Yeah,
we thought that it would be interesting for some of you guys that might like our homage projects to know what are some of our frequently used tools. FamiTracker, Defil Mask, those are trackers. So Defil Mask, we use that Genesis, Game Boy, NES, whatever you want really. FamiTracker, NES. FM Drive is a wonderful Genesis VST that I'm a huge fan of. VOPM is another one that I used in the past. C700 is a great SNES VST that we adore, and that's what we use now for our SNES projects.
And it's free to use as well.
And then Chip Sounds is a nice kind of fake, some people say fake bit, I don't like that term, but it's another kind of diverse VST that has a lot of cool sounds.
So yeah, the first two, the trackers, are more, I mean, some of you might know this, but it's more almost like a programming language. They have a steeper learning curve. They're not, a MIDI interface. They're not something you'd use in a DAW, a digital audio workstation. But they allow you to create sort of a finished product that's probably the closest to, like, actually being on the NES or the Sega Genesis.
And the code that it exports is the kind of code that could be on a cartridge and then played by the console.
In the last four on that list are examples of programs that emulate the sounds of consoles and allow you to use kind of like MIDI piano roll type notation.
And those would be plugins you could use in your DAW, like Pro Tools or Logic or Reaper or something.
There's a lot more really good ones too that we could put on this list. Yeah. I think now is a great time to open it up for some questions.
And one last point I wanted to make that...
no, Marty, it's time for questions.
Didn't end up coming up in the conversation.
Do you have a question?
If there's sort of one takeaway from the homage approach, I would say... beyond immersing yourself with the music is see how deep you can take that immersion, and ideally deeper than just the source material that you're looking at the music that inspired those composers. And that's a quest that may take you back hundreds of years, but it's one of the most meaningful journeys you can take.
It's very rewarding and worth it, for sure.
Absolutely. Yes?
I think you kind of answered this question, but I've heard of things called sound fonts.
Sure.
Is it more like ripping the sounds from the...
So yeah, you encounter that more with people that are maybe emulating Nintendo 64 kinds of things,
or Super Nintendo. There's Super Nintendo sound fonts. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of sound fonts. I think they sound kind of crummy. It's like it's taking like the smallest chunk of that repeated sample. Some people get decent results with them. They're fine. For example, if you were going to do Super Nintendo music, some people use SNES sound fonts. I would not personally do that. I would use C700. You can actually load the actual SPC files that you can get anywhere on the internet,
but
and so
using
you'll have
sound
all
fonts
the settings there.
might be a nice way to compose in real time with some of those sounds, because you'll probably have a lower latency experience.
That is definitely not what we've done. In the past, stuff like C700 didn't exist. So, like for that Metroid album, I remember like I just went through the whole Super Metroid soundtrack and would try to find moments where there were long notes and just record them. And so I had these huge categorized folders of instruments.
Well, and then we would load that into a different sample player that was very similar to how the SNES would take samples. And so we would take one G, it was like G3 or whatever.
We come from a long line of masochistic.
We could pitch it up and down, but if you pitch it up, it would like let's say it had vibrato da. If you pitch it up da, just like the SNES did.
Yeah.
So that was very
limiting. That's the signature sound
process.
of the SNES strings. When they get higher, the vibrato gets super fast. Yeah, that's great. Any other questions? Yeah.
This one's a little complicated, but
sure.
Like, In the past, I wanted to make something similar, like a track that was maybe an homage to Yoshi's Island.
Sure,
in
sure.
Particular.
Yeah.
I don't have the chord knowledge, like all of
Sure,
the
sure.
shifting of modes and everything, and I'm listening to Koji Kondo over and over again. And,
Yeah.
Man, is there any kind of shortcut or a place you would start if you wanted to build a track up from the ground up, but you didn't quite have all those layers in your mind that you can?
I think that's.
I don't know if there's a shortcut.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think there's any shortcut for anything in music, but I think what I will say is that I've grown so much as a composer and a musician, and even just on the podcast, my ability to talk about this stuff
From
just
listening to
playing it, from not. A big part of it is trying to figure stuff out by ear. So it's like, because I love Koji Kondo, even if you don't have strong facility on guitar, piano, any instrument, it's like, if you can try to figure things out by ear, by memory, and try to figure out what are those chords. And what's helpful with Koji is, like Marty said, so much of his stuff is in C. So if you think of that as your home base, it's a good way of learning about interesting. You'll start to notice, like, a lot of his melodies tend to land on this note, or he likes to go to this chord at this point in time. Because these aren't things that we read about in a book, and it's not like we came into it with this knowledge of modes and some sophisticated. A lot of the stuff we learned from video game music and from kind of digging this stuff apart. So I'd say, like, you definitely don't need to know what the Mixolydian mode is to use it. Like,
Right.
I didn't used to use that term. I used to just talk about, like, now I'm going to, like, the flat
You
7
just need to know
chord.
how it sounds and feels.
Yeah.
And I think I can't recommend strongly enough getting it in your fingers in some way, and whether that's playing on a keyboard or on a guitar or playing around with tracks at a sort of a slower speed on your computer or something. There's something about that experience of recreating that music yourself with your own fingers.
It'll stick
and your
with
own
you more.
instruments. It goes into your brain in a different way.
No,
It's
having
what I've
said that, I do think that studying the basics of music theory and the basics of a lot of different, like, traditions of, like, different musical genres will go a long way. So, for example, one of the things that we were really inspired by with our Yoshi's album was listening to a lot of and thinking about a lot of African folk music and, like, African hymns, a lot of which we happened to grow up singing in church and loving. Those were really inspirational for our album. It might not have been for Koji originally, for Yoshi's, but it was something that we heard in that music, and it was kind of our way in a way.
There's another cool phenomenon, though. There's so much great music that may have started from a similar place to what you're talking about. I love this song. I love this piece of music. I want to play in that same sandbox. And maybe the resultant song
totally different.
might not sound exactly like it, but it might be great, you know. And it might be its own kind of great thing. And there are a lot of entire genres of music that you could argue have kind of come up that way. So
I mean,
it's all wherever that journey takes you, it's going to be a good.
You mentioned
choice.
Ravel earlier, but he had sort of an interesting quote where he sort of said, like, what makes a composer's personality is their inability to accurately imitate a previous composer's style. So, for instance, he was really influenced by Gabriel Fauré, who did this famous piece called The Pavane, and he wrote his own in an attempt to imitate it. They don't really end up sounding that similar, but Ravel's argument is that his personality is the difference between the two, is the fact that his inability to perfectly accurately replicate it, that's where he found himself. And I know a lot of composers might reflect a similar thing. So I think it's like, no matter what the result is, if you just invest in the process of doing it, I think it will be incredibly rewarding and probably a great learning experience.
Well, I think most of you probably in this room do know this already, but we do host a video game music podcast called the Super Marcato Brothers Video Game Music Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can listen to us nerd out every Monday. Sometimes it's Will and I host it, and sometimes we have our lovely, handsome brother Marty join us to add to the nerddom. So feel free to come, talk, and we can hang out here. We can hang out in the hall for a little bit and ask us some more questions. We're going to send you guys on your way with Colossal Caverns, which was my homage to David Wise in the DKC series.
And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much,
really
everybody.
Appreciate you being here.